The Broadcasting Foundation of America presents the International Literary Report, a weekly radio journal presenting profiles of authors, reviews of their latest works, and news of other important literary events from around the world. The effects of television headline-style newscasting and the expanding short-item radio news service concern many observers of the media. They point to the decline in newspaper reading. They note the potential dangers of group thinking where there is no in-depth news coverage. One prominent English television producer has become so concerned about current trends in communicating information and news that he has written a crusading book explaining the problem. Edward Blishen of the BBC staff recently talked to him about his anxieties and his new book.
The television producer always seeking profundities in 60 seconds. Well, that's a provocative phrase from a book I've just been reading, a really quite hard-hitting survey of television in Britain. Tomorrow's Television, it's called, and though it's concerned with the past and present of television in the UK, it also and inevitably has much to say about the way that television's going, and not just in Britain, because developments there are likely to influence developments elsewhere. The author of Tomorrow's Television is a television producer and editor, Andrew Quick, and I asked him about the new priesthood that he says has emerged in television. Who are these new priests?
The new priests are directors and producers in television who choose to interpret the world in a particular way, which depends partly on their education and partly on their political and religious or non-religious approach to life. They are people who do mould the way our nation thinks, not deliberately and not fundamentally in a sinister way, but their effect is very real.
So they are a powerful group of people who are actually making us think in particular ways, even though they don't intend dictatorially to do this.
That's right. There's a powerful groupthink among television producers who meet at the bar at lunchtime and in the evenings and talk about each other's programs. And very often, as a television producer myself, I know that one's more concerned with what one's colleagues think than on its possible effect on listeners.
You say that within the next few years, decisions have to be taken which will vitally affect the pattern of communication for our children and grandchildren, presumably not only in Britain, because any decisions made in television anyway are likely to be infectious and to affect other parts of the world. Well, what sort of decisions are these that will determine the future?
Well, we've accepted in most countries that if you want to write a book or publish a newspaper and you can afford to pay for the printing, then you should be entitled to do so. When it comes to broadcasting, although it's not very difficult to make a radio program or a tape or even a television program, and it's getting easier all the time with modern equipment, you absolutely have no right to make a program and transmit it unless the people who control the broadcasting media permit you, and they are normally governed by a very strict government decree. Now, I want to see a relaxation of those decrees. You can't let everybody broadcast on all the wavelengths, so we've got to have some discipline. But just as it's possible for private individuals to drive their cars and trucks down a road, as well as government vehicles, so I think private individuals, within restrictions, certain restrictions, should be able to broadcast on what they feel passionately about. We shall always need the skilled radio and television producers to help them, but I want to see more outsiders appearing on television.
Well, one of the resistances to giving people access, ordinary people access to television, seems to be what you call television's essential cowardice, that it dares not be dull.
Yes, I think that too often, and I speak as a television producer who once cut a university professor talking about the reform of Parliament from 20 minutes down to 3 minutes, and eventually we abandoned the whole thing. And he was, quite rightly, very angry, because we distorted, indeed rendered meaningless, what he was trying to say. And I don't think that we should cut people too short. If we do that all the time, when they're making serious points, we make the whole thing a nonsense. I like to imagine Moses coming down from the mountain with 10 commandments on tablets of stone. And when he gets to the bottom of the mountain, there are the waiting newsmen. And they say to him, "Moses, what have you got?" And he says, "I've got 10 commandments. And they say, "Okay, tell us about them, but keep it to 90 seconds. But in the evening news bulletin later, we just hear the newsreader saying that Moses came down from the mountain with 10 commandments, the chief of which was anti-sex, anti-homicide, and an attack on the consumer society."
Andrew Quick. His book, Tomorrow's Television, is an Aslan paperback.
The next guest on BFA's Literary Report is Noam Chomsky, the creator of a widely debated theory of language. Mr. Chomsky, who is a professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was recently on the campus of Cornell University to deliver a series of special lectures. And while there, he talked to Joe Leeming about his theory of a universal grammar, that is, his belief that all languages are based on a common set of rules, or what he calls linguistic universals. Mr. Leeming began their conversation by asking Professor Chomsky to explain the basis of his theory.
Well, let me just say to start that universal grammar is quite an ancient idea. The current work, mine included, modifies it in many ways, but it is picking up on quite a distinguished classical tradition. The problem arises very simply. One observes that a child enters the world with some kind of predisposition to acquire various systems of knowledge, language being one, and the child is presented with rather disorganized experience. Certainly no specific teaching is required to learn language, and most children have no teaching. On the basis of this experience, the child acquires an extraordinarily rich and complex system of rules and principles that provides amazingly sophisticated and refined knowledge of the details of language structure. And furthermore, children do this in quite a uniform way. It appears to be almost independent of intelligence or other attributes that we can discover. It just seems to be a species-specific capacity, rather like the capacity of a bird to grow wings or to navigate or something of that kind. Well, the natural, putting aside the possibility of miracles, the only possible explanation for this can be that the predisposition to learn language involves a rather sharp and precise characterization of the kind of system that a language can be. It's as if, to put it loosely, the child comes into the world knowing that what he's going to be presented with is a language of a very specific type. And then his problem is to determine whether it's Chinese or English or Indonesian or one of that small range that's permitted. Given a very sharp and highly articulated pre-existing account, genetically determined account of what language may be, it's possible to imagine how a small amount of information might select among the range of alternatives that's permitted. Well, thinking in those qualitative terms, one is naturally led to trying to discover precisely what that biologically given, that genetically determined schematism might really be. And what it appears to be, so we tend to believe, is a system of rules and principles that specify what kinds of mental representations constitute representations of language, and also that determine quite sharply and precisely the kinds of mental computations that are permitted. A very small set are permitted, vastly many others that can be imagined simply are impermissible and don't constitute hypotheses that the child ever has to reject. And insofar as one can, I think there's been some progress in the last, say, 10 or 20 years in providing a plausible, at least, account of what many of these principles of mental computation are, and in showing that some significant range of phenomena can be explained in terms of them. Of course, there are immense areas where we really have no insight at all into what's involved. This, let's hope, will be susceptible to future research along the same lines.
You make me wonder, does the definition of these rules or further description of them lie within the field of psychology or linguistics?
Well, in my view, linguistics is just a branch of psychology. That is, it's that branch of psychology that deals with this specific mental faculty, namely the faculty of language. I should say, however, that though I think that this is a conceptually accurate characterization, it does not really coincide with the way psychology has viewed itself. That is, in order to accommodate the study of language as it should, psychology has to quite substantially redefine itself. It has to define itself in a more traditional way as a study of mental faculties. And if to the extent that it does so, it would naturally incorporate the study of this particular mental faculty.
How much progress has been made in defining these rules more clearly, or is a simple statement of the rules possible, do you think?
Well, I think there's been considerable progress in stating very precisely certain rules and principles. However, it has to be recognized that the scope of the explanatory scope of the system that's precisely defined is by no means all of language behavior. In fact, very far from it. The kinds of questions that, well, let me talk about the questions that are on the border of inquiry to give some sense of where things are. Let's imagine, for example, the process of forming questions in English. So if I have the sentence, John read the book, I can ask, what book did John read? Or if I say, John thinks that Mary read the book, I can say, what book does John think that Mary read? On the other hand, if I say, John believes the claim that Mary read the book, I can't say, what book does John believe the claim that Mary read? Now, the question is why? Why can I not say in English, what book does John believe the claim that Mary read? Well, one might say it doesn't mean anything, but that's just not true. It means something perfectly clear and definite. It means what book is such that John believes the claim that Mary read it, which is a perfectly sensible meaning. So that's a perfectly fine thought. We can think it. In fact, I just expressed it, departing really from the resources of English, which it's technical English, not colloquial English, that provides locutions such as such that and so on. But in normal colloquial English, in English as the child learns it, there is simply no way to express the thought, what book is such that John believes the claim that Mary read it.
No, I would guess the instinct would be more to say, how does he know? In other words, attack the word claim rather than the book.
Right. You'd have to question the claim. You could say, what claim is it that John believes, or something of that sort. Well, now the question is, why is that true? How does a person know that is the question. How do we know that we're not allowed to say, what book does John believe the claim that Mary read? How do we know that we're not allowed to say that as a well-formed sentence of English? Well, you might argue the child is taught, but we know that that's not true. I mean, the issue never arises. People know this without any experience at all. So we're naturally led to look for a principle. And there are a number of proposals in the literature. My own view is that this has to do with a certain principle of cyclic application of rules in mental computation, which would be too complicated to explain, but some general principle of computation, in effect, does have the consequence that that sentence should be unformulable. And by assuming that that principle of computation is simply part of the structure of the brain, we can therefore explain the fact. Well, it's data of that kind that provide the current challenge to theories of universal grammar. Now, often these data become quite complex. Still, they, again, I want to stress, are very far from exhausting the range of linguistic behavior. In fact, there are some typical questions about language that we simply don't even know how to approach, where we can't even propose a hypothesis. Take the most striking one, a kind of an obvious fact about language that strikes you as soon as you begin to think about it, is that it has what has sometimes been called a kind of a creative property. That is, the normal person, in his normal use of language, is constantly producing new expressions which he's never heard before, which have maybe never been produced in the history of the language. And furthermore, every time you read a newspaper, or for that matter, engage in a conversation, you're being presented with new sentences, totally new. They're not on the pattern of old sentences. They aren't analogous to old sentences. But you're completely unaware of this. I mean, they all look perfectly familiar. I mean, there's no sense of unfamiliarity in new material. In fact, it all simply belongs to your system. This production and comprehension of new sentences is, as far as we know, quite unrelated to any stimulus control. There are no external stimuli. For all we know, there are no internal stimuli that seem to have any relationship to our ability to carry out this creative use of language.
How do you explain the strong reaction to your theories today, among linguists?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that there has been I've just now been talking about an early modern tradition, but we have behind us at least a century of work that beliefs that are run very counter to that. There has been a very intensive effort within the human sciences in the past century or so to develop an approach which in the last 20 or 30 years has been called the approach of the behavioral sciences. And the term is indicative. I mean, it's a study of behavior and the control of behavior. Now, that's very different than a study of mind. And in fact, the whole concept of behavioral sciences is really a very curious one if one thinks of it. I mean, it's perfectly true that behavior provides the data that we use in studying humans, just as, let's say, meters provide the data that we use in physics. but nobody would dream of calling physics the science of meter readings. Well, I think a comparable move took place in the modern human sciences. That is, they shifted from a study of their true subject matter, say human nature or the nature of mind or something of that sort.
Or the rules behind
it,
human
right?
nature.
They shifted from that to a study of the data itself, and the term behavioral science indicates that. It's a very, it's an important term. I think it shows, it reflects a shift that took place in investigation. In my view, that's a shift away from natural science and a shift towards something like butterfly collecting, that is just arrangement of data and control of data and so on and so forth. And there's very little that can be done about control and prediction of behavior. It's just not an interesting topic. I mean, there's small areas where you can do something with it, but it leaves untouched the main aspects of certainly human existence, and I would assume of most animal life as well. And again, I think it's just an offshoot that departs very far from the spirit of the natural sciences. I mean, the natural sciences, and maybe some low-level technology is concerned with control, but the sciences aren't particularly concerned with control. They're interested in understanding what lies behind things, and they search for the sorts of phenomena that will shed some light on what lies behind these things. On the other hand, the behaviorist beliefs have virtually eliminated from consideration, sometimes in principle, an investigation of what lies behind the phenomena that we observe.
And as a result of your work, do you think this is changing?
Well, I think it's changing as a result of a lot of things. I mean, there have been many counter-developments in the past 20, 30 years, and my feeling is that that behaviorism is essentially finished. I mean, fortunately, and that there has been a return in psychology to. In many ways, there is a return to. There's an effort to reincorporate it within the general field of the natural sciences by eliminating these kinds of irrelevant dogmas.
One last quick question. Am I right in thinking that a number of linguists have adopted your work enthusiastically and are in the process of revising it, which is a sign of their support of your theory?
Well, the field is in a constant ferment. I mean, it's very hard to distribute people in schools. I think there are many people working along similar lines, much controversy among them, different approaches being explored. And in general, the field is in a state of quite intensive and rapid development, which also means a good deal of controversy and debate. All very healthy and exciting, I think.
Professor Noam Chomsky has been talking about his theory of a universal grammar underlying all languages. Mr. Chomsky, who is a professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, has recently presented the annual Messenger Lectures at Cornell University. Joe Leeming of Cornell University talked with him while he was on the Cornell campus. BFA Literary Report now goes to Hungary, where Radio Budapest presents a review of the first Hungarian novel written about the Hungarian gypsies and their famed music. The book is titled Swarthy Pictures, and it is written by Mindjárt Lakatos, who is himself of gypsy origin.
It appeared twice within a short period of time in almost 100,000 copies, quite a number in a country with 10 million people. This popularity is partly due to the fact that it has almost become a fashion in Hungary nowadays to be interested in gypsies in general. Over the past 30 years we have learned that gypsies are equal Hungarian citizens, having the same rights as anyone else in Hungary, and not only singing and dancing or begging on the streets, but working as any other members of the society. But they have much bigger difficulties in really exercising their rights. Because before 1945 they had been the victims of racial discrimination throughout centuries, and it is their centuries-old backwardness which they have to overcome first. This is why they are still in a much more troublesome position as compared to other Hungarians. There are still a great many Hungarian gypsies who live in poor hovels in gypsy settlements, for whom 30 years seem to have been insufficient to change their life, on one hand, and to completely overcome still prevailing open or hidden prejudices on the other. But there are others who are noted economists, engineers, actors and teachers. Some of them work as skilled or semi-skilled workers, or, as Mindjárt Lakatos, have become men of letters. There are 320,000 gypsy people living in Hungary at present. but they do not constitute a national minority group, as the Slovaks or the South Slavs. Although they have a language of their own, but a gypsy from eastern Hungary hardly understands another one coming from the western part of the country, and their vocabulary consists only of some 100 words and expressions. And they do not have a unanimous musical culture either. What you know to be gypsy music is actually a collection of composed songs and pieces from the turn of the century. And there are hot debates by writers, sociologists and other experts on what should be done to solve the problem of Hungarian gypsies and what concepts are wrong about them. In one thing all the sides agree, that their old way of life should belong to the past once for all. And that way of life is described in swarthy pictures by Menyhért Lakatos. He was born in a gypsy settlement in Békés County, eastern Hungary, 50-odd years ago. His father was a horse dealer, and his mother sent the small boy to school. It was not easy for him to be accepted in school, and it was even more difficult to succeed in continuing his studies in secondary school and to complete it without failure. Surely his personal experiences had a major role in motivating him later to return back to his native place, Vésztő, to teach gypsies. In the 1970s he started to write short stories, and then his first novel, The Swarthy Pictures, appeared in 1975. There he gives an authentic description about the life gypsy people lived in the 1930s, recalls his own personal memories about their own settlement. He clearly feels how much of those old things are still prevailing among gypsies, and, in fact, gives an indirect explanation about the deep roots of a number of habits and attitudes one can see even today among the gypsies. He writes both about wrong and right things in a way that one should feel indignation over it. He uses sharp naturalism to an extent that seems to be sometimes unbelievable for the first sight, but the fact that it is said by him convinces us that he is right. The inhabitants of the gypsy settlement in Swarthy Pictures waged their everyday struggle against cold and hunger to survive, and meanwhile they remained intact from the events of the outside world. Lakatos makes us feel how outlawed and excluded gypsies were by the outside world, because official people and others living in their surrounding did not want the gypsies to be involved in their life in any way, and this was why the inhabitants of the settlement lived in the completely isolated strange world of their own. The gypsies there did not know what time meant. There was neither Monday nor Tuesday, neither weekday nor holiday for them. They knew seasons just because in summer they felt hunger and cold not so often, and the old gypsies noted their age by estimating how many times they saw leaves falling down. One often felt despair when reading how passively they lived day by day, how inconsistent they were with each other. What was allowed for themselves could easily be a reason even for murder if committed by someone else. It gives a special value to the novel of Menyhért Lakatos that nowadays, when the solution of the problem of the gypsies emerges as a burning issue, and the ways and means in which they could be helped to become an integral part of the whole society is sought for, the book shows from what depth gypsy people had come, how long a way they had to pass until today, which helps people realize that it is not enough to grant equal rights to the gypsies as well, because they have to be understood and aided in a number of ways to overcome all the burden they inherited from their past.
Anna Gulyás of Radio Budapest, Hungary, has presented that review of the book about Hungarian gypsies titled Swarthy Pictures, which concludes today's BFA Literary Report. Be with us again next week at the same time over the same station, when the Broadcasting Foundation of America will present another in this weekly series of international literary reports.